Dr. Eric Koester, thank you so much for being on the Yoke and Abundance Wise Women podcast. It is an honor and a pleasure to have you here today.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, can you tell folks a little bit about who you are and what keeps you busy in this great, big, beautiful world?
I am a professional troublemaker, is sort of what my wife says. So so most of my life has been sort of spent really kind of like diving into the things that were interesting or problems or curious to me. And so I sort of was that kid growing up who had the lemonade stand like early on. That was how I made money. And I kept that kind of like entrepreneurial vibe going. I started my first kind of little company when I was in high school and wound up paying for college from that little experience. So I've sort of always had this bend that I think came from my dad. My dad was always sort of this tinkerer and person who was just always sort of like trying different things. And so that's kind of been how most of my life has really gone. I spent, I did spend a chunk of time sort of working in traditional jobs. I worked as an accountant. I was a CPA, crazy enough. I worked in law. And I think it was when I got in law that I started to recognize that there may be this opportunity to play more in like the startup space, the kind of entrepreneurial space, more as a career, not just something I was doing on the side. And so I've actually left sort of the big law world and got a job at a fast growing startup in Seattle. Had kind of got the juices going, felt this is pretty exciting, and really kind of led me on a journey as an entrepreneur. And I started a company that was backed by Ashton Kutcher thereafter. I started several other companies, and sort of to sort of boot up to today, I got a crazy opportunity as a result of all of this to start teaching at Georgetown. And I never considered myself someone who wanted to teach. Frankly, I would never have gotten into Georgetown as an undergrad. So here I am getting the chance to teach undergrads about startups. And it was very flattering. It really, really was. But what I would tell you is after about a year or so of doing it, I found myself very disheartened by the whole thing. Here I am like, out there trying to help people start companies and being more entrepreneurial. And very few of my students were going on to do it. And I sort of found myself at this point kind of stuck. Like I didn't really know how to actually engage people and help people. And so I actually tried to quit. So I quit teaching and I said, hey, this has been fun, but I'm out. And Georgetown told me no. And they said, listen, like you can't quit. We don't have anyone to teach your class this semester. And so I was sort of miffed. I was summertime and I was like, I didn't really want to teach something that I knew wasn't making a dent on people. And so I thought a lot about it. I was like, all right, so I got one semester left that I'm going to do here. Why don't I do something crazy that might actually matter? And I kind of reflected a lot on my own life, like what had sort of most mattered to me early in my career. And when I was in my 20s, I had this really unique opportunity to write and publish 2 books. Now, the books themselves weren't bestsellers. I didn't make any money from them, but the process for me was huge. Suddenly, like, I began to see myself differently and other people saw me differently. Like all these new opportunities began to open for me. A lot of the things that happened in my 20s and 30s, I can trace back to that very moment. And so I'd never taught anyone to write a book. I didn't know, I'm not like an English writer, stuff like that. But I knew it was a lot like starting a company to me, these same things. So literally 3 weeks before class is about to start, I came up with this crazy idea. And I took my syllabus, which was how to start a company, and I pushed Control F and I replaced the word startup with book. And then I walked into class and said, let's go. And that was 4.5 years ago. And that has led me on this incredibly crazy journey where I have helped more than 800 authors publish. Just this year, 5 National Book Award winners or finalists. And it all started sort of because I realized if you could help people do one of the hardest things that there is to do, to write and finish a book is really hard and challenging, then maybe there was an opportunity to help a lot of people really realize this dream and potential. And so here we are on this crazy journey.
I love that. So there's so much about your story that I'm fascinated by. First, I'm fascinated by the fact that you had entrepreneurship kind of in your blood, like from the beginning. So many of the women that I talk to, we kind of go into it. I think that a lot of the people that I've spoken with, it's not that we wanted to become entrepreneurs. It was
Sure.
that we have this thing that we have to do and put out into the world, which means that we have to figure out how to become entrepreneurs in the process. So I love talking to people like you who it's like always kind of been there. It's
Mhm.
that energy is always present. And then what is the statistic you shared with us? How many first-time authors actually who try to go it alone end up publishing their book?
It's really low. It's sort of shocking. So writing a book is actually, according to the New York Times, one of the hardest sort of endeavors we can tackle. Only 2% of people that start books will ever finish them. 2%, which is
Yeah.
incredibly low. That's a lower success rate than getting into certain the top graduate schools, then running a marathon. I mean, it is one of the hardest things you can do, which is very interesting because it's actually the act of writing a book is not the hardest thing that you do. It's just, I think a lot of it comes down between what's in our ears, in between our
Absolutely.
ears.
Yeah, before I got into your program, I had written like 28,000 words towards a book that I know is not supposed to be a book.
Yeah.
And then after just talking to you in the application interview that we did, you said, "Well, you really just need to start interviewing people." And I knew that you didn't say go interview people now, but I took that as go interview people now. So I ended up interviewing like 33 people before the program had even
Amazing.
started. And it helped me shape a lot of the ideas to really focus in even a little bit more on the direction the book needs to go and what I need to be researching to tell the right stories in that
Yeah.
book.
I mean, it's a very common thing. I think, it's interesting. And I think it's, whether it's books or whether it's business or whether it's other kind of, pursuits that we have, I think a lot of, ambitious and aspirational people believe that it's just them, right? They're the one that has to do it. And I think, one of the things that I spend a lot of time researching and studying is sort of what does it take to succeed? I have a book that's coming out called Super Mentors, all about like people who are high achievers, people who achieve great success. And when you study people like Sheryl Sandberg, and you study people like Mark Zuckerberg, and you look at people like Warren Buffett and Oprah Winfrey, what's interesting is that all of them get people who are talented, ambitious, involved in things that they're working on much earlier. And I think that's a big part of what I've realized is that, like, community really does matter a lot. And we are tribal beings here. We need people around us to hold us accountable, to lift us up when we're struggling. And I think that's sort of what I recognize, the success rate in this sort of community powered writing and publishing that we've been doing for the last few years. It's not that we do anything magical or unusual or unique, but it's just that we do it together. And I think that's sort of the interesting piece here that I would share with any of your listeners who are trying to think about doing anything ambitious, whether it's, they want to do a new project, they want to sort of, change jobs or whatever it is. The simplest thing you can do is get other people involved in your journey, like really before you even begin.
Yeah. And okay, so something I love so much about your program is you have a process for everything. Everything has process. So it's like
Yeah.
plug and play, right? Was that by design or did you come into that with time?
So I think it's one of the things that you learn, so that I learned. So, the first thing that I would sort of say is it's part of what is the hard part about doing anything for the first time, is that you sort of go into it and you just sort of like are wandering around aimlessly figuring things out. And I think the important thing to know is that when you're tackling something challenging and ambitious, most of the time someone else has come before you, and it's your job to see if you can deconstruct and figure out what that is. So when I started teaching this class, obviously, like, I had taught some entrepreneurship courses and learned a bunch of things. I had the really good fortune to learn from a guy named Steve Blank, and I had kind of shadowed Steve, who is one of the godfathers of the lean startup movement, for about 6 months. And I had this really great experience to really learn, from someone else who was doing it. And what I learned a lot from Steve is that he studied people and figured out patterns in people. And so when I sat down to try and figure out how I was going to teach this book thing, remember, I'm not like in the English department. I had never taught anyone else to do it before. I really didn't have like kind of the right credentials or the right training behind it. I just knew that I had written a book. The first one was incredibly hard, and the second one was a lot easier. And so I had this like theory and thesis about like, well, maybe that's normal. The first one is just really hard because no one tells us how to do it. But then what if we could teach everyone how to do it like they've done it before? And so I went out on this sort of journey here. You talk about like talking to people. I went out and started talking to people who had written multiple books. And I just said, hey, what did you do differently on your second book that you didn't do on your first one? And I started to get all these, oh my God, let me tell you all these things. It was like, it was sort of cathartic for them, because I think that what happens is once we've figured out something, we understand like there's a process and there's a system and there are tools. And so what I just started to do is say, well, let me just like capture these things and see if I can like help someone else go through the learning I went through. So I talked to 80 to 90 people who had all written multiple books, and I just captured my notes, and I realized like there's some very simple patterns. And then you start to say, well, great, what if someone else was starting a book and they didn't have to go through all the painful things that the rest of us did, and they could just start as a second time author? And that's sort of what happened. I think that's kind of like been my secret of life in general, of any kind of success I've had. It's that I try and go figure out like what other people have done. And I don't view it as like, you don't just sort of say, here's what X successful person did, but you actually gather a number of stories and things like that. And you start to say like, is there a pattern here? And once you can figure out the pattern and you can apply it to yourself, and then you can teach it, that's, I think, where some of the things have happened. So the whole entire community is built on this idea of community powered like learning. We distill it down into like what other people work and say, this is not to say what you must do, but here's some ways to know that what others have done that you can learn from and make it your own. And I think that's the secret here, is that like, anyone who wants to do something challenging for the first time should go in and learn how others do it before jumping in. And, I think, many of us, who write books, and the reason I think it's so hard is that we did learn how to write like term papers and things like that. We've learned how to do these things, but I think sometimes that translation isn't something that we make to sort of say, well, let's see what this would look like and how to learn, from something much bigger.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a couple lessons that you've already taught us that have totally changed my life, not just in the book writing thing. But the first thing that you talked about is you shared how to talk to people about the book that you're writing. But you
Mhm.
didn't teach it. You taught us not only how to talk about it, but you said nobody likes a know-it-all.
That's true.
And this was that's such a powerful statement, and I'm really glad you said it, because nobody also likes to look stupid, right? And so I
Yeah.
think that in my pursuit to not look stupid, to not come across as ignorant, I try to share everything I know about something. And so I've really taken a step back, and I've applied that not to just to how I talk about the book, but how I talk about most things that I'm doing now. So thank you for that therapy. It was fantastic. But also, you set up for us in the beginning, the first month, you just taught us what the practices are going to be. What are the processes we're going to start implementing to be successful?
Right.
And in that, you taught a whole section on becoming indistractable.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So there's some, there's a lot of really interesting kind of, people always are trying to improve and build new habits. I mean, there's like a bazillion books out there about habit building, about goal setting, about all these things behind it. And I think I think the most important thing in any sort of like major large project is essentially just not quitting, right? I mean, that's like the simplest thing out there behind it. And what's interesting is that there's a woman from Harvard named Teresa Mobley who wrote a book called The Progress Principle, and she did some research on sort of satisfaction, mostly in the workplace, but she wanted to understand like why some people were happy at work and why other people were dissatisfied at work. And so she did what's called a diary study, where she had people every day diary what they did that day and what it was. And so she studied tens and hundreds of thousands of these kind of entries that people were doing. And what the results came back were very, very simple, but very powerful, is that people who felt like they were making progress towards meaningful projects or meaningful outcomes every day were satisfied. Those who didn't feel like they were making progress felt dissatisfied. And so I think a big part of any kind of large scale creative endeavor is making sure that you remember that progress isn't always what you think it is. And it isn't necessarily the way that you imagine in your head. A lot of people, when they think about tackling a book, for example, is they think day one, I'm going to sit down and write chapter one, and I'm going to crank out 500 words. And you sit down and you write chapter 1, and then you're like, well, what else do I write? Now, what do I do? And what happens then is we start to like have these doubts creeped in. And then we have a whole bunch of documents that have a title and chapter 1 that we've never gotten much further than that. Or we have a bunch of words that we haven't gotten over the secret. So one of the most important things that I tell anyone who's kind of engendering on a creative project, sort of a bigger creative project, is the first thing is like to really be kind to yourself. And that's the most important thing that I think we all need to tackle here, is to remember is that like pretty much every book that you read, it was pretty crappy at the very beginning stages, or worse than that. And that's okay. I think grace is probably one of the most important things to remember, is that making progress to me is making time every single day or every single week. And as long as you put time on the calendar, that to me is progress. I think that's the first thing that I always tell anyone tackling a project. Again, whether it's a book or whether it's launching a new venture or whether it's, trying to develop a course, like time is ultimately the currency to know you're making progress. And if you are making time towards it, that's great. And if you're not making time towards it, put it on your calendar, and that will make a big difference behind that one. I think the second thing that's really important to know is, so you're talking about this idea of indistractability or being indistractable in these processes. I think one of the biggest things that happened to me is the fact that like we ultimately look at, when we're ambitious and we're busy, we give ourselves free passes when we don't make progress. We say, oh, listen, like, there's all these things that are distracting me. And we sort of do a lot of external blame when we're distracted. So we tell ourselves, I'm going to write this week, or I'm going to put time on the calendar. We don't. We say, well, it's because, my kids were distracting this week, or my job is distracting, or my phone is distracting, or whatever it is. And so what the research actually shows is these external things that we blame for distraction are really rarely the cause of why we're distracted. What turns out in the research, and there's an amazing book out there called by Nir Eyal called Indistractable. There's another book called Deep Work by Cal Newport, who's a fellow professor with me. But both of them talk about the same things, is that distraction is essentially just unhealthy escape from kind of negative feelings we're having. So the better thing is, rather than blaming your kids or blaming your job or blaming whatever it is to actually try and figure out, like, what are you afraid of? What are you nervous about? What is holding you back? And for me, I went through this in a major way. Like I had a book project that I'd been working on for about 6 months, and it started to stall. And I think a lot of people, yourself included, come to me and say, hey, I did this sort of stuff, and then the wall hit. I stopped whatever it is behind it. And what I often hear is, then I got busy. And that's what happened. And I said the same thing, like, oh, I'm just too busy. The reality of it is it usually comes down to what's going on inside us. And most of us just don't take the time to reflect on what that is. Again, we blame these, what we call these external triggers. The reality is,
put a pin in this really quick, because you started having these doubts on, is this your third or fourth book?
Yeah, this is on my third or my fourth book at the time. Yeah, this is my fourth one.
Your fourth book. So I want listeners to hear this. Like, I really want to put a pin in this. Like, just because we've done something once or twice or 3 times doesn't mean that doubts don't creep in.
Absolutely.
So, all right, sorry, keep going.
No. And it's a great point to make here. And I think it's important of, whatever project it is, whether it's a big project, a small project, whether it's a work project or a school project, is that I think where we find ourselves stuck, it's oftentimes easy. And no matter whether you've done it 100 times or whether you've done it for the first time, it's easy to blame I'm too busy as the cause of it. Right. And, I hear this a lot from people. I work with hundreds of authors at a single time. And oftentimes, early on, people would say, I'm too busy. I've got all these stuff like that behind it. And what I always tell people is, it's just, you're not too busy. It's usually that you're afraid. And it is true. And for me, that was the case here. I had done books before, I helped hundreds of people do this. And what I was wrestling with was sort of imposter syndrome. I was struggling with this idea that, I had these X number of words behind it. I was worried that people were going to judge me. They were going to, again, sort of critique me and things like that. These nameless faceless people I'd never met. And a lot of what I had to first do was sort of to reframe that entire process. And so I think when, any of your listeners are finding themselves stuck, whether you're on page 1 or whether you're at word 30,000 and stuck of what to do next behind it, I think the first thing is to remember that it's rarely because you're too busy. It's more so that you are seeking out distraction rather than doing the thing that you are supposed to do or think you're supposed to do. And it seems sort of obvious when you say it out loud, right? We're talking about right here. It's like, well, of course this makes sense. It's far from that when you are in the middle of it, right? Like in the middle of it, it's like, well, but really like right now I'm particularly busy. Like work is really ramping up for me, right? It's all these things. And for me, it really did take sort of this, kind of like shock conversation that I had with Nir on an interview where I started to recognize like really what is going on and started to actually name it and started to actually talk about it, that then I was able to figure out a plan to move forward through it.
Yeah. And can you share some of those things that you did to move forward through that?
Yeah, so there's really a couple things that I think are important when you're dealing with this sort of idea of distraction. And again, we talk about this in the context of helping people write books. And the reason I think I guess I would say, if you want to know why I think I know something about this a little bit, is because writing books are things that are hard. 98% of people fail at it. So the fact that we're able to get like almost 80% of people over the line through distraction means that I think the sort of understanding of how this applies in the book world is relevant. So, but this isn't just books. It's whatever kind of thing that's stopping you, whether it's, I want to launch this business, I need to grow this business, I want to, again, do this project, any of those things. So I think the first thing that you really do have to do is name it. And there's essentially like a series of sort of different types of, doubts, insecurities, things that are going on, uncertainty. I don't know what to do next behind it is one. I am frenetic in terms of like, my life right now is structured in these sort of 15-minute increments. I can't get blocks of time. That's a type of sort of internal thing that's going on. But a big one, I think, particularly for ambitious people working on ambitious things, is this idea of kind of imposter syndrome. That sort of this idea of sort of these feelings that we have of doubt and insecurity. And so the first thing to really do is to name it. And that oftentimes comes from just sort of saying here, why am I not moving forward? What is going on with me? And it's not easy to do. It's sometimes can be really hard to do for yourself, which is why, oftentimes in these first conversations I have with an author, there's a reason that I only let people in the program who get on the call with me first, because I think it's important to recognize that like what has stopped you from this point. No one comes in the program sort of saying for the very first time, I think I should write a book. They've been saying I should write a book for the last 10 years, or I should write a book for the last 6 months, whatever it is. So there's something that's held you back. And so first off, you just have to name it. Why have you held yourself back behind it? Maybe I didn't know what to do, or I didn't know how to do it. The second thing, though, is really important, is recognizing that there is a time component in making any sort of progress. And I think that's kind of what we led with earlier, is that projects, change, habits, they do take time. They certainly do behind it. And I think you have to make time for projects. That's probably one of the biggest things to do. And if someone comes to me and says, I don't know why I'm struggling right now, I always tell them, show me your calendar and I'll show you your problem. And oftentimes that's it. It's not that we need more time. It's just that we need to spend our time on things that matter. People sometimes call me like the book professor. I'm the prioritization professor. That's what I do, right? Like, I just want to help you prioritize whatever time you have to do it. And, I think that's the big part of it. So you have to make time for traction, and any kind of change is going to require that one. And, again, it's about judging yourself, not on the outputs of what the time is, but what the time is itself. So for me, what that meant when I was in this point is I named the beast. Then I figured out like, well, when do I actually like to do this work? When I like to write? And it turned out for me, I am mostly a nighttime writer. That's when I sort of make the most progress. So like actually last night, I was writing until about 2:30 in the morning. Oh. And for some people that sounds crazy, but like for me, it's when I get in flow state. So I recognize that. And so I said, all right, like I need to finish this project. I want to make time for it. And so I just said, listen, I've got 3 little kids. I've got a 6, 5, and 2-year-old, right? So I've got little kids. And after they go to bed, I read them bedtime stories, I put them in bed. And then I made a commitment that for 30 days, I was going to write 4 nights a week after they went to bed. So that's what I made. Like, again, it was going to be a couple hours. So, I was putting a commitment to myself for a month that I was going to do 10 hours a week after bedtimes. And that was it. So I made that commitment to myself. So I named the beast. I set time aside that I was going to do to it. And I put it on my calendar. I blocked it off, and I had those pieces. So those are the first 2 steps. The third one, though, is really where I think that I've had the biggest learnings. And that is why, when we describe what this program that you're in, this book program is about, is it's called community powered writing and publishing. And this is where the psychology of humans really comes into it. We are outsized influenced by other people. So other people have a much bigger role in our success and failure than sometimes we believe. We believe that we are, rational, logical creatures, and we do all these things behind it. But there's a reason why people who perform well at the gym are likely to pay for coaches or are likely to have training partners. It's because there is this sort of psychology around how we interact with other people. And this is the third one that is called creating packs, P-A-C-T. And packs are really one of the most important things that leverage really this idea around kind of accountability and those sorts of things. So for me, what that meant is I had to make these sort of informal agreements with other people to help hold me accountable. It just is the way that we're all wired behind it. We don't like to let people down. We're happy to let ourselves down, but we really don't like to let other people down. So remember what I was suffering through. I had two big things that I was struggling with. One was kind of my own imposter syndrome, doubts, fears, like, could this guy who teaches other people to write books write his own good one? And I was dealing with time. Like, how did I actually kind of, again, make time for myself? Because I had struggled with those pieces. So I leveraged others. The first step was making the time. I had this time set aside at the evening times, and I just leveraged my spouse. My wife is an incredible partner, and she doesn't get in my business, but I told her, hey, listen, for the next month, I'm going to be trying to write after the girls go to bed. That simple act right there created this informal pact, this linkage. And what happened for me is that in the evening times, if I would be kind of in bed and watching something on Netflix or watching a game or whatever it was, she would just casually mentioned to me, I thought you were writing in the evenings. And it wasn't that she was like holding me accountable, but she was helping me hold myself accountable. And that was the first pack about this time here. And so when you put time on the calendar, the most important thing you can do with that is let important people know that you have set aside time for making traction. The second step, though, is really dealing with the idea of kind of what are those fears and doubts. Now, remember, for me, the big concern that I had was like imposter syndrome, which is probably what I'd say 80+% of people that I work with on books or courses or whatever it is struggle with. And so what happens oftentimes in these cases is that we are worried about people that we don't know. And what happens is sort of there's this psychological trick we play on ourselves where we believe that people who don't know us will judge us harsher than we would judge people that we don't know. We have this very challenging thing here where we believe that others are constantly judging us harshly. The first thing I will tell any one of your listeners, most people don't give a rat's tail about you. They just don't care about you, right? They're all busy with their own stuff behind it. So first off, people don't care about you, number one. And number two, if they do care about you, well, darn it, you've done something quite amazing that they do. So the first thing is you kind of have to worry less about people who are outside of your circles. What's more important is figuring out the people that are close to you that actually do care about your success and your ambitions. Now, again, for me, that meant identifying 3 people that were really important in my life. And so my best friend, Shane, my brother, Mark, and one of my close friends from college, Heather, had always been people who I'd turn to for all of life's, kind of adventures, challenges, sort of steps along the way. And so what I did is I had this goal. I was going to try to finish this manuscript, sometime in about a month or so. And so to start that journey out, I just sent them all a text message saying, hey, I've been working on this kind of manuscript for a bit. I want to send you something at the end of the month and sort of see what you think about it behind it. And that simple act, remember, I was nervous about people judging me. Suddenly everything flipped around because people who love me, are excited about me, support me, they got back to me right away. It's like, oh my God, I can't wait to read it. When should I block off time? And suddenly, rather than being nervous to share it, I was excited. And what happened to me was pretty transformative. Again, I had this block of words that were stuck and I hadn't made a lot of progress over the summer. Suddenly in 11 days, I had added about 20,000 words to my manuscript just because I was excited about it again. I made time for traction. I got people involved in the process. And suddenly like the book was re-energized. Now, this isn't to sort of say like this happens to everyone, but I think what's important to know is that there is a process here that we can leverage about what we know about humans. And what we know is that We need to be making regular progress. We need to have that feeling like we're making progress towards something. We need to understand how to use time as the key thing that we're tracking in that progress. And we have to remember that progress doesn't happen alone. We may be the one who's making the words and telling the stories, but a lot of it is making sure that there's other people along the way that really will help us get there.
I love that. Do you have anything else that you want to share today with
It's like the biggest question, the biggest loaded question. I mean, I guess what I would say is a couple of things, especially for what you shared about your audience. I'll share a couple of things that is really interesting. I think the first thing that I would tell you, so I spend a lot of time researching kind of success, like what does success look like today and how do people do it? And so I did a big study where I studied almost 5,000 people that had made it on the Forbes 30 under 30. Now, the reason isn't the list is good or bad. It really doesn't, whatever you think of the list is sort of neither here nor there. But some people have said these 5,000 people are successful, young and early in their career behind it. And I think what's important to know is that, especially for people who are ambitious today, we sort of have been told this story about success that I actually think it's really a lie, is what I would sort of share with you. I think the first thing that people always tell us is that, it's about the company you keep. And so as a young, ambitious person here, you need to go to the best school possible. And what I found in this list is that wasn't the truth. Only about, like 15 to 20% of the people on the list went to a top 10 school. And in fact, what's interesting is there was over 500 different schools represented on it. So sure, like go to whatever school you want to, but don't assume just because you go to an elite school or a great school, or whatever it is, that it's going to matter. The second thing is that, graduate school really matters here. Once you figure out what your path is, you should go to a great graduate school. And what's interesting on this list I found is that there were more people on the list who had dropped out or never even went to college than went to graduate school. And so again, graduate school is an interesting thing for you to give yourself confidence and to learn those things behind it. But it isn't one of those things that necessarily itself is an accelerant either. The last thing I thought is that maybe this is a group of people who take risks young. They're starting companies in college behind it. And that's not the truth either. They're not starting companies. When the people on the list are starting companies, they're more likely to do it in their late 20s than their early 20s behind it. But the big thing that I did find that was really fascinating is about 85% of the people on this list had a meaningful project that they worked on at some point earlier in their life. And so what I would share with people in this community, in this sort of audience that you have behind it, is if you're finding yourself stuck, and stuck can mean anything. I'm, in school and I'm not sort of on the right career path. I'm not getting the jobs I want, or I'm working and I'm not on that path, or I have a business and it's not going where it is. My advice is really to sort of think about, is there a project that you can tackle that can help you? And the best things to know about projects that I think really are important is you should pick a project that is finishable. Do something you can finish. And that's why I love things like doing a book, or I love things like putting together a video course. That these things that you can finish are really important. So pick something that you can finish. Don't start a blog. Please don't start a blog, because you can never finish a blog. It just is always there, right? You can write a 10-part article series, but please don't start another blog that you're going to write 2 and then never finish. And then it's an incomplete. So start things you can finish, number 1. Number 2, start projects that are by their very nature collaborative, right? There's a reason that I think that, audio shows, podcasts are really interesting, because you bring other people into it. Books are great because you interview people into it. Again, sort of YouTube, sort of all these sort of things are great because they involve other people in it. So again, make it finishable, make it something that is collaborative. And the third one, and the most important one, is do something that it doesn't matter if you make money from it. Do something that is just really sort of something that's important to you behind it. I think too many times people get worried about, I want to start a business behind it. And I think that's great. But, I would tell you that, like, pick a project first, rather than putting all this pressure on yourselves of it has to make money, all these things behind it. Projects, to me, are the secret of success today. And like I said, 85+% of people that I studied had some kind of meaningful project that I could find. It wasn't that they went to great schools, or it wasn't when they went to graduate school. It wasn't that they start companies, but they did start projects. And I think that's what you find when you find projects that are, again, sort of meaningful, they're collaborative, and they're finishable. That's, I think, the secret of success today.
Oh, thank you. Last question. So much like when you interview folks and you have us take a picture of their choice, our last question here at Yoke and Abundance is, how do you live a life of abundance?
I think it's a great question. And I think that you recognize that you are not competing with any person you meet. I think the most important thing to know is that your success is never something that is competing with other people's success. In fact, what I would say, and different in that one, is that you have the ability to help elevate both your success and life behind it. When you start to think about that one, I think it's one of the reasons why sort of this sort of book program has been so interesting, is that for a long time, authors competed with each other, thinking if I get a book deal, then, or if you get a book deal, then I won't get it. When you flip things around and recognize that, like, there's no such thing anymore as I win, you lose, or you win, I lose. I think there's we win. And when you live your life thinking about how can you create more we wins, your life will be so much happier, more fulfilled. And frankly, like, you'll just achieve everything that you want and more.
Uh, Eric, I think you and your work are absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Absolutely. Glad to be able to do it.